Hello, everyone. Welcome to the web seminar, Achieving Resiliency in the Mid-Market, Shifting from Recovery to Replication, produced by ITPro Today and sponsored by Carbonite. Please note that this web seminar will be available on demand for 12 months starting tomorrow. You will receive an email when the session is available for review. Also, if you have any questions for our speakers, please feel free to type them into the question box on your webcast console. At this time, I would like to introduce our speakers. Nick Cavalencia has over 25 years of enterprise IT experience as an accomplished consultant, speaker, trainer, writer, and columnist, and has achieved industry certifications including MCSE, MCT, Master CNE, and Master CNI. Nick has owned an MSP focused on the SMB, an enterprise IT consulting company, and today runs Tech Evangelism, where he serves the IT community as a technical evangelist working with some of the most recognized tech companies today. Nick has authored, co-authored, and contributed to nearly 24 books on Microsoft technologies and regularly speaks, writes, and blogs on a variety of topics. Lilac Schoenbeck leads product marketing at Carbonite. With over 2 decades of experience in IT service and software marketing and disaster recovery, cloud and virtualization, she has worked with customers and partners around the world to communicate the benefit of these solutions. She holds an undergraduate degree in computer science and an MBA from MIT Sloan. And with that, I will hand things over to Nick Cavalencia.
Thank you very much, Ashley. Welcome to everybody to today's webcast. I'm excited to talk about this topic. I love talking about DR, business continuity, availability, all this kind of stuff. It's one of those topics that sometimes just sort of falls to the wayside. And today's we're really focusing kind of on the mid-market. And the mid-market to me is sort of the often forgotten demographic of customer when it comes to DR. Every DR vendor and service provider, they of course want the enterprise customers because they've got the big dollars there, or they want the SMB customer because they've got a simplicity in terms of their requirements. But for those of you that are in the mid-market, you're neither of those things. And yet you have the very same DR needs, and you of course want to leverage the very same technologies as your enterprise counterparts. And so as each of your organizations goes through its own digital transformation that we've seen over the last number of years, the need to use the cloud and achieve resiliency becomes more and more, I'll sort of put it as an absolute, than just another sort of hopeful requirement around your DR. And so the question becomes, how can the mid-market achieve true resiliency without the budget or the technology constraints? And so in today's webcast, Lilac and I are going to have more of a discussion than anything around the challenges of availability, making the shift to resiliency, and what you should be planning for in order to achieve that resiliency. And today's format is a little different. It's not death by PowerPoint. I think I've got a total of like 5 slides or something like that. And Lilac and I are going to use that as kind of a way of establishing a dialogue back and forth. I've got some questions I was thinking up for her today, and we're going to have a bit of discussion. We'd love to include you in on it. If you have some questions, stick them in the Q&A box. We'll both either, if they're appropriate for the conversation as we're talking about it, I'll try to include you in on the conversation, or if not, we'll certainly have questions at the end, and we're happy to include you in on that as well. So let's jump in, and the first place that I want to start with is the idea of leveraging the cloud, thinking about resiliency, and then your organization's needs. The Spiceworks puts out their State of IT every year, and they listed in this year's report a couple of the top reasons that organizations go to the cloud. And it's like access to data anywhere, disaster recovery, of course, better flexibility, which makes sense, especially around DR, and then reducing the support burden that the internal IT staff has. And in that same report, and by the way, there's the link to it. I kept it there in case you guys want to be able to take a look at the report itself, so feel free to write that down. I'll leave that up here while I'm talking. Also found out that 41% of organizations are using the cloud, and this is sort of loosely done here, saying for backup and DR. What does that mean? The report doesn't really say, but it could be anything from we're using storage, so you could just be using hot, warm, and cold storage up in the cloud somewhere. It could be they're using it true for DR, for actually you're going to recover into the cloud. Maybe they're going to leverage virtual machines. Maybe they're doing replication. It's not really exactly clear, but 41% are using the cloud somehow for backup and DR. And then also 38% of organizations want to enhance what they're doing today. So they've already established that we like what we're doing in the cloud, or whatever minimum amount maybe that they're experiencing today or utilizing today. They want to do more with the cloud around DR. So it's definitely the cloud, and this idea of resiliency and this idea of leveraging the cloud for DR makes a lot of sense to most organizations. I'm assuming you as well. That's why you're on today's webcast, just to learn a little bit about it. And then there's one other report that I found. It's from SyncSort. It's their 2018 State of Resilience. And DR is the number 2 initiative that organizations have today. And it's kind of, I'm telling you that because maybe you're thinking about what are your own organization's initiatives, and maybe DR isn't at the forefront. It really should be. And from a standpoint of, you think about in the news, anytime an organization is down for an elongated period of time, whether it's from a malware attack or ransomware attack, just an outage of systems, whatever it is, that stuff is newsworthy. Everyone wants to eat that stuff up, and you don't want that kind of thing. Oh, I should actually put the link to the report there. Sorry about that. You don't want that kind of news focused on your organization. And also you have customers that are expecting that you're going to be up and running and things like that. As a matter of fact, maybe that's where I'll start, and maybe we can start the conversation here. I've got a couple of notes on this slide, and I have a couple of questions planned for you. And maybe we talk about this problem of achieving high availability. I talked about at the beginning here, for you guys in the audience, that the mid-market is sort of that often overlooked demographic, and I sort of see it this way. I see the mid-market as being sort of, you have expectations put upon you at the same level as an enterprise, but you have not exactly an SMB budget, but you have a much smaller budget than your enterprise counterparts. And those two things don't equate exactly, right? That's kind of puts you in a tough spot. You're supposed to deliver the world, but you're supposed to do it for $1. And it doesn't always make sense there. And then each of you have probably a lot of very unique scenarios in terms of what you need for recovery. It's not as simple as, let's say, in an SMB where it's just, I have server 1, of the one server they might have in a very small business. I need to recover that. It doesn't work that way. It's far different because the scenarios might include loss of data, loss of application, loss of system, loss of location, loss of internet access. I mean, there's all kinds of different things you might be trying to plan around different scenarios, and you have to be able to support each and every one of those. And for a lot of organizations, the idea around cloud adoption is still in the early stages. And what I mean by early stages is that 41% that I talked about in the last slide, my guess, just from my own experience, my guess is a lot of that is they're leveraging the cloud for storage. So that there's at least off-premises storage. That way, if I do have a loss of location, I have an ability to recover somewhere else. But there's still a lot more adoption that has to take on there. And, of course, the expectations around recovery are extremely high. No one cares how often you back up, but everyone cares how long it's going to take to recover. And you start thinking about things like recovery time objectives and recovery point objectives and having them be in single-digit minutes. That's a really high expectation for a mid-market organization. And then I wrote this last bullet this way. I put not just that budgets are low, but I've also put that sort of short term. They're not thinking long term in terms of how do we plan to ensure that as the organization grows that we have enough budget to make sure we can recover whatever we have in place today. If we're going to grow over the next year, do I have enough budget in place that I can also allocate resources in the cloud, on premises, whatever it is, to address the recovery needs of what the business is going to look like in a year? So I've done enough talking. I definitely want to pull you on the conversation here. So first off, welcome, and thank you for joining me.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
I hope so. So let's start with the problem. Let's do that. I feel like the mid-market is sort of the middle child of the DR world, right? They have the aspiration to deliver this enterprise caliber DR, but I'm going to guess a lot of our audience sort of feels like that's out of reach. Would you agree from your own experience?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's I would say an expectation, assumption that it's out of reach, that it's just at the edge of their ability to consume it, either because the pricing has historically been exorbitant and just way out of anything that they could even float up to the leadership team, or because historically a lot of these technologies were really complicated and required specific expertise on the part of the IT practitioners. And largely we see incredibly diverse, talented individuals in the mid-market that know how to do a whole lot of everything, but not a super, super deep dive into one specific area, which is often the way the technologies were architected.
I sort of call them a jack of all trades, but master of some. You know, to your point, and I agree, there's a huge amount of expertise, but it's sometimes not in it's really hard, especially when you're applying that to DR, because even if you are an expert in, let's say, in running a VMware environment, getting that recovered may not be something, maybe not to run it, but not necessarily recover from it, and that kind of thing. So I totally agree. How about adoption of the cloud? Are you guys at Carbonite, you guys seeing it being used by the mid-market for DR in the same way enterprises do, or is it maybe more like for storage, or what are you guys normally seeing in terms of your prospects?
We certainly see a great deal of backup in the cloud. The storage, like you mentioned, putting the files out there, making sure that there is a secondary copy. What is the way that I like to think about mid-market, the term mid-market sort of, I don't think anybody self-identifies as a mid-market individual, just like nobody really thinks they're of average height, right? Like the mid-market is, to me, typified by a group of people who don't have secondary data centers, secondary hardware sitting there waiting for a disaster to happen. That's the kind of expense that a mid-market organization typically can't support. And even not just from budget reasons, but for a business risk perspective, there just isn't a mandate to create a secondary environment in another floodplain, often miles and miles away from the primary headquarters of the organization. And so for those organizations, for mid-market companies that don't have their own on-premise secondary storage in a second location, they're initially using cloud as a backup storage environment, a target, if you will, and increasingly considering the ways in which they could recover from a disaster with that storage, but knowing at least the data is somewhere else. If this whole data center floods or gets invaded by marauding buffalo, the data is somewhere else.
Is marauding buffalo a big problem for most organizations? I just love that.
It really depends on the region. It's very regional. Yeah. No, in other places you see more of a infestation issue with insects, for example.
Sure. Yeah, mosquitoes down here in Florida. Okay, good. Got that. So let's talk. You mentioned budgets a little bit. Let's talk about budgets. Are you seeing that there's always that sort of, in the DR world, the CapEx, OpEx sort of discussion where, some are maybe still focused on the CapEx, like we're going to buy hardware, and I always find that that's a problem because it's sort of a stair-step kind of methodology in terms of usage of the hardware that gets purchased. Like, you buy I'm making this up sort of as I go along, you buy a terabyte the storage array, and you get to like 800 gigs, and then you go, oh, we need to buy another one. So you never actually fully utilize what you have. You just keep buying more stuff. So that's sort of the CapEx problem, or are you seeing that they're moving more towards the OpEx, the operational expense kind of thing, where they're sort of, renting or leasing, or it's more just a service subscription cost? What are you seeing the mid-market doing these days?
A great deal more in the OpEx category, far less in the CapEx category, partly because in order to really be doing this, right, that secondary environment, sometimes it's just storage, right? But you certainly don't want failover servers sitting there basically doing nothing, right? Like waiting for calamity. It just isn't cost effective. It doesn't make sense. And so we're seeing a great deal more focus on OpEx. The other benefit of OpEx is that you don't really have to make long-term decisions, to your first point, right? If your business grows, doubles, changes, shifts, if you buy some sort of software platform that requires significant additional resources, whether storage, CPU, whatever, you can really quickly pivot your OpEx spend with almost any vendor. They'd be overjoyed to take on more, or usually fine with taking on less, versus actually having to build out or shrink a CapEx-based environment.
No, and I'm glad to see that there's a bigger focus just on the OpEx, and I think that kind of aligns with our discussion. For you guys in the audience, the question is sort of, what are you spending that on? Is it just like to your point, Lilac, is it just on storage, or is it on something more than that? And so what I want to take the conversation is to talk about maybe making a shift from recovery to resiliency. And I've got a couple of notes here, Lilac, again, and I've got some questions I sort of thought out for you. I really want to bring you in on this as well. Is for you guys in the audience, I always see recovery as just purely about the data. It's just about I have this data set, whether it's files in this folder or everything on a given server or all the data that's necessary to recover an Exchange server that might include a little bit of Active Directory and some services and some OS stuff and some databases, whatever it is. But it's always just about the data. And resiliency is different because resiliency takes a whole different approach. It's about whether or not the business remains operational or not. And so a couple of things that I see here around resiliency that kind of give it some more color is things like being able to respond to any kind of disaster. And by disaster, I almost should put disaster in air quotes because a disaster could be something as simple as some data got corrupted on a server, or it could be, what was it, bison, buffalo? What was it going to migrate through the
I'm sure those are very related species.
Yeah. Sure. Whatever it is, but it's any disaster that's coming in play. And then you've heard both Lilac and I say the business is going to change. So the resiliency is the ability to keep that same sort of level of being able to respond regardless of what the business changes are. We add more offices. We add different applications. Maybe we're switching. We're utilizing something in the cloud, something on premises only, whatever it is, just adapting to all those needs. And then also you start with the business needs when you're defining all this, and you work towards the technology. Normally, most IT organizations start with the technology and go, this is what I can accomplish. And that's fine, but you never actually ask the other way around. What does the business need? I mean, just a simple example is going to the C-suite saying, all right, define for me, forget everything that I do. Define for me what parts of the business must stay up and running. And they go, oh, well, we have to have this application and that application or these services or whatever it is that, however they want to define it, and you kind of work backwards to the different applications and services and then systems that need to be up and running. And then you ask them, all right, what does that look like if that's down for the organization? They go, oh, it'd be horrible. And how long can we be down with that particular service we're providing, like customer service or something, down? And they say, I can't be down more than an hour. Well, now you've suddenly got an RTO for a set of services and servers and systems and applications that on the back end that correspond to that particular part of the business. And that's really where you're starting to have a conversation about resiliency, because you're starting to think about what does the business need and how do I accomplish whatever the business needs, whether it's not necessarily being down an hour, because resiliency is really about trying to be up as much as you possibly can, but hopefully you get my point. So, Lilac, let me do this. Let me start by asking you to define recovery and resiliency in your own terms. I've given mine, so how do you define them, and maybe what's the difference?
I think these are good definitions. I'm certainly not going to argue with an expert on it. I think when we talk to customers, typically resiliency does have that superset of, well, okay, the systems might be up, but how quickly can my users get to them? Are they able to work from where they are? Are they able to get to a safe place, right? That's the whole business has to be up and running. So if you in a sort of simple scenario where you're running a storefront, sure, the cash register has to work, but a cash register working doesn't help you if the doors can't get unlocked or the whole store is flooded, right? So to me, resiliency of an entire operation has to be beyond IT. It includes IT, but it is beyond IT in its full planning end to end, right? And I think the recovery of the data and the recovery of the systems in certain industries is 80% of the problem, and in other industries is 20% of the problem, right? It just depends on what you're, in fact, trying to run. I think for anybody, though, right, the whole point of recovery is to get the systems back up and accessible to the end users with some current state-ish of data, right? And what your tolerance for losing data depends on the organization and the system. What your tolerance for downtime full stop depends on the system, right? An operation that's running 24/7 has far less tolerance than an operation that's only running 9 to 5, right? And so I think for one of the greatest things that I think mid-market organizations should consider is like, what is, it's great to say this is my absolute top tier system and it better be up as fast as possible. But you sort of have to modulate that with at what cost and versus what else and relative to how fast you can get to the officer, right? Like these are the sort of control factors that enable you to make the right rational risk cost decisions for your business.
I'm in complete agreement. I love the detail going down to really thinking about the users and their accessibility to the applications, and not just thinking about, are the systems up. Oh, and on a side note, I love that you Freudian slipped and called it a crash register. I don't know if you even caught that, but you did. And I love that because it was crashed. So that was good. Yeah, you did. Then you corrected yourself and called it a crash register. That was awesome, though. I loved that. It was a crash register. So anyways, so as we kind of tie all this in with thinking about, I talked about the cloud early on. Do you think our audience should be thinking about resiliency as sort of a, I'm doing air quotes, a cloud-only thing, or should they be leveraging their existing data centers? I mean, you pointed out they may not have a secondary data center and things like that. So how does the cloud kind of come into play here?
I think the right strategy for most organizations is to have a copy online. If you're thinking of straight backup, have a copy online, locally in your environment, because that copy from a latency perspective for large amounts of data, it's just a whole lot easier to be able to just grab what you need, whether it's a file or a folder or an entire virtual machine to reconstitute. Having something locally in your environment is just faster and easier. And have a secondary copy out in the cloud. I think the key issue here is that if I'm a IT leader in an organization with fewer than 30,000 IT employees, part of me is thinking in the back of my mind, great, you just told me I need software, I need hardware, I need a cloud service provider, and you haven't even talked to me about the speed with which I can recover in that scenario. You've just told me about keeping my data safe. Lady, I got a lot of things to do. So I think the right thing to do is to try to look for an integrated solution, and I say that fully aware that I'm going to come back and tell you guys all about Carbonite solution in a minute. But I mean, I do believe that these are the elements of what makes things effective, cost-effective, and also support a variety of risk profiles. One copy locally that you can get at cheaply. You're not paying egress cloud fees from some public cloud. One copy beyond your walls if, in fact, your data center comes under the attack of a marauding group of buffalo, and some mechanism for recovery for the systems that are critical in the timelines that you need.
And I think that makes a lot of sense, and the cloud is the perfect place to do that, just because we talked earlier about CapEx and OpEx. And CapEx means,
Exactly.
In some cases, if you're going to actually buy the location and buy the hardware and so on, I mean, obviously you could rent the hardware. You get really, technical and say, well, some of it's going to be OpEx, but you get the point. So I'm in complete agreement. So let's do this. As part of the IT resiliency discussion, you started going down a path and get a little detailed around about accessibility to the users and things like that. And so one of the things that I wanted to talk about around resiliency was sort of this issue of failover and failback. Everyone in the audience, you already know when you come up with a DR plan, and even if you test it, or some of you don't test it, I know that happens, but you execute it, whatever it is, everyone's thinking about failover. And certainly the cloud, even cloud-based recovery, and I mean where the cloud is the target of the recovery, not just where you keep the backup files, but that usually involves some kind of failover. But resiliency isn't just about keeping it up and running, to Lilac's point about, can your users access it and that kind of thing. It's not just them being able to access in a state of, oh crap, the Buffalo came through and now we've got to switch to our non-Buffalo location or something. It's also when you're done with that and the Buffalo have moved on to greater pastures or whatever, that there's an ability to also fail it back. And I think that that's a really important factor here. And so the questions that I sort of rhetorically want to pose to you guys in the audience is, does your DR plan include feedback and failback? I can't even speak today. And actually, I want to ask you guys that just as Lilac and I are talking, stick something in the Q&A box and just tell me, do you actually have failback as part of your DR plan? I mean, in my mind, I'm thinking you at a minimum have more than just, a line that says, and fail it back. You have some level of detail of what needs to be done. And I'm wondering about that from both sort of in execution, like you have it in the plan, but also have you tested failover and failback? So that's sort of my question for you guys in the audience. Just an unofficial, if you want to participate, you can. If nobody wants to, that's fine too, but I wanted to throw it out there. Tell me, just stick some stuff in the Q&A box to kind of color our conversation on this slide. But do you actually include failback as part of your actual plan, and have you have tested it? So Lilac, while we're waiting to see if any commentary comes in here, I want to start with what I think is sort of the number one problem with DR, and that's, of course, testing. Would you agree that in some cases for our audience, it's probably far too complex and too costly to test failover and failback?
Oh, yeah. I mean, and it make no mistake, this is a feature or a function of the vendor you're working with, right? As somebody who's been in this party for way, way too long, failover testing is something that for a lot of organizations they would prefer to do at a time convenient to them, which is usually after 5 p.m., which, let's be real, is often inconvenient for a vendor, right, because we'd prefer not to have people working late. And depending on how automated it is, it may or may not involve somebody at your vendor site, so they may or may not be interested in that. It may or may not be self-service depending on the architecture of the infrastructure. The whole thing ends up boxing you in to pre-scheduled testing often with significant lead times, often with additional costs. And all that does is deter people from testing because it becomes kind of a pain in the something. And so testing just becomes deferred. And you're like, oh, we'll do it next month. Oh, we'll do it next quarter. Oh, we'll do it at Christmas break. And at the end of the day, the problem with not testing is that you don't actually have any confidence that the system's going to work. So as the buffalo come charging toward your data center, you're thinking to yourself, I could push this button, but I'm not fully sure what's going to happen. And that lack of confidence keeps you from pushing the button, and that means the entire system, frankly, is moot. You need to be able to do testing frequently. Best practice, by the way, is probably once a quarter. Common practice is once a year. We do have a customer that is clever enough to be doing it once a week because they're a compliant financial services organization who are like, nope, every Friday we're flipping over. Yeah, right? That's the kind of commitment to testing we want. But I'll tell you what, if the buffalo came at his data center, they wouldn't have the second thought he would press that button, right? To me, you want to look for a vendor who's going to enable you to do as much self-service testing on whatever schedule you want, because that's going to directly correlate with the value you get out of the system in a pinch.
You had me on a sidetrack there. I'm a very creative thinker, and you're talking about pressing the button, and you remind me of my son goes to an engineering school, and some of the kids in one of the engineering labs actually took a Staples button, and they connected it to a Raspberry Pi machine that they configured to basically go out to the Domino's Pizza website and order a pizza and put it on one of their teachers' credit cards, and they used that for an entire semester. Anytime, I'm not even kidding, they actually did this. They just pressed the button. I'm sitting there going, someone could actually make a button, like a really real button, and just stick it in a data center going, fail over. And it would happen. It can be done today.
Yeah, it's a really good thing I don't run the UI at Carbonite.
It'd be a big red button in the middle. So Russell came back and said failback and testing is part of a monthly activity. So he's closer to your financial services company. T. Loria says,
admirable. Gold star.
Yeah, it is. T. Loria says snapshots are preserved. I think it's Limor, I don't know if that's a capital I or an L, but says, I need more info, not sure what is failback. So let me cover that. I'm glad you actually said that. That's important. Everyone knows what failover is, I'm hoping. That means, of course, we're going to take our systems that are, let's say, on premises in a data center, for the sake of argument, and we're going to spin them back up in some other environment, either at another data center, up in the cloud, and so on. And so now we're in this situation where that's great. We got everything back up and running, but it's somewhere else where it normally isn't. And now that the Buffalo have moved on and my data center is fine again, I want to pull everything back down to my data center. In just my example, it can be done a million different ways. You might leave it in the cloud permanently on infrastructure as a service or whatever. But in my example, I want to put it back where it used to be in the data center. That's the failback. And that's the part that not everyone has planned out is, how do I do that? How do we take all the data, back it up, make sure no one's on the systems, we get all that data pulled back down, are we replicating, what are we doing for that? And that's kind of what's meant by that. So in fact, let's do this, Lilac. Let's talk about failback a little bit. Most of the organizations that I talk to, I think they have a grasp on failover, but it fits either in these sort of we have a plan but we haven't tested it kind of category, or maybe the we'll address it when it happens kind of category. So are you seeing the same thing with your prospective customers?
Yeah, increasingly we're seeing it as sort of a requirement up front, which is really heartening to see. We joked when we were talking about this sort of Hotel California problem, right, of like you can check in but you can never leave, right? you can check out, I think is the lyric. But at any rate,
Sure.
the whole idea that once you're there, you're trapped, and there's no either cost-effective or functional way to get out of the cloud environment that you're on. And candidly, a decade ago when DRAD services were being born, that was part of the business model, right? There was an element of like, and that's how we'll get them onto our cloud. And that's fine, but maybe not ideal. It's not the plan that you were hoping for, I think, to be hoodwinked into somebody's cloud environment. Failback, therefore, is increasingly important, and people are increasingly aware of it. And so, and thanks for the question, Limor. I'm going with that pronunciation.
Mm-hmm. It is an L. They said it's an L. But go ahead.
It is.
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I thought you were keeping going. My apologies. So
no,
that's good.
No.
Perfect.
Oh my God.
So let's do this. Let's talk about the cost factor. I mean, you're giving the example of like the being hoodwinked into staying up in the cloud and things like that. There obviously are costs even just associated with the failover and failback. Putting aside those other costs, there are there hidden costs that the audience should be aware of with failback? I mean, would you talk a little about what you're seeing around the cost of failback and so on?
Well, there's a number of things that you can consider. Firstly, some organizations have chosen to simply charge for that activity, which in itself is a little bit terrifying to me. Others charge egress costs, which are basically the cost of moving the data out of their cloud environment and back home. Oftentimes, when you're looking at the way that clouds bill for things like storage and other things, egress costs, it doesn't cost much to store there, but in order to get your pictures back, right, after your iPhone blows up, it'll cost a fortune per gig to get it out. So that's where they get you. So those can be really prohibitive. And then some simply just have a very uncomfortable mechanism for failing back, meaning if the technology sort of doesn't just reverse the arrows of replication and take you back home, you're often in a situation where you could potentially lose data or incur downtime in the process of failing back, right? What was an incredible value prop, failover in minutes, lose almost no data, becomes not an incredible value prop on the way back home. And that's down to the technology and the architecture of the environment.
Yeah, I see sometimes I know the egress fees come into play, and it does make sense from a standpoint of like, well, data has to go over our pipe, and that does cost money. I mean, I get it. There's definitely some tangible costs, but sometimes I feel like egress fees are more back to your early statement of maybe it's like, maybe you should just think about just keeping it here, maybe. And it's not unreasonable, but at the same time, if you're only charging because of that, then I wouldn't really care for that. But if they're not, then okay, I'm good with that. So let's do this. I have a quick summary slide, and I want to just kind of summarize everything we've talked about here. And I know that you've got a couple slides here, Lilac, and I'd love for you to cover those as well. We definitely have plenty of time. And then for those of you guys in the audience, if you have questions on anything we've already talked about or any of the stuff that Lilac is going to be covering in her slides as well, make sure you stick those in the Q&A box. So the idea here for you guys in the audience is you're trying to figure out how to get to resiliency. And I think you've heard from both of us, both Lilac and I. We want to encourage you, think like an enterprise. You definitely want to be looking to have that same level and not be thinking that the de facto standard is, well, I can't really afford that. Instead, there are solutions and solution providers that are out there that are trying to address this and are addressing this, and you need to keep thinking like an enterprise and not thinking that it's financially out of reach or it's too complex or you don't have the expertise for it and so on and so forth. The end game is the most important thing here. You're trying to figure out with resiliency, how do I have this uptime? And I'm going to put a caveat on it that I love that, Lilac, that you brought in today about your users being able to access the applications, the data. I mean, it's not just that it's up, but it's accessible, the business is operational, and that's really what you're trying to do here. And then you've got to, again, think about the entire process, not just Lilac just pointed about a minute and a half ago about the whole, it's great, it sounds like a great plan, we'll get you back up and running in minutes, but then getting you back on premises or back to your data center or back in your own cloud or whatever it is, that may not be part of the plan. And you should be planning for that, especially from a resiliency standpoint. It's not just can I get the services back, but can I do it in a way that doesn't interrupt the business, doesn't interrupt operations here. And then the cloud is the obvious choice here, I think, for trying to find a cost-effective means to do this, because you have so many cloud service providers and so many providers of solutions and services that can that leverage the cloud in a way that make this very low cost, keep it in an OpEx, not a CapEx type of situation for you, and provide you with this high-quality enterprise class kind of solution here. So I'll leave it at that. Lilac, I know you've got a couple of slides, so why don't you take things over, and then we'll do some questions at the end.
Awesome. I'm excited. Thank you so much. So I think wrapping up everything that we've talked about so far, right? We've talked about a set of concerns with respect to recovery and with respect to resiliency. There are significant costs associated with this downtime, right? I think that's something that we often think of the largest organizations suffering for millions of dollars of lost revenue when, you know, a website or a sales site goes down. Even a smaller organization would experience significant costs to having downtime, whether that's costs associated with lost sales, right, through a web portal or through something else, or whether it's operational costs from lost productivity. An assembly line going down, or 50 developers unable to work all day is a significant encumbrance to a business, and I think we've all experienced that. Separately, businesses of all sizes are the targets of ransomware right now. Individuals, grandmas, everyone is the target of ransomware. The joy for the ransomware perpetrators is that it's so easy to spam the free world and just catch whatever you catch. And so there isn't any particular desire to only target those with gajillions of dollars in their coffers. They're happy to take 10 grand off of each individual. And in fact, 10 grand is a typical ransom that's paid for companies for their data. That's a huge amount of money. And that can be avoided with a strong data protection plan. Because obviously, if you have another copy, it's just as easy to revert to yesterday and tell the ransomware person to pound sand. Downtime costs will often ultimately cause businesses to go out of business. And that's, I think, the saddest part of this whole thing is that while some organizations can recover from days or weeks of outages of their systems, many cannot. That's because increasingly, even small businesses are so dependent on their IT systems in order to run, and at some point there's reputational damage, at some point there's, well, just go down the street to your competitor because they're available today, and you end up having a very hard time recovering, and that, small businesses aren't always running with a tremendous slush fund, and so that can really take them down, and that's very unfortunate. I think that's perhaps the saddest thing about this whole thing is that for not a huge amount of investment, you can achieve the resilience you need to keep your business going in the case of an outage or something happening. So I think ultimately you're sort of looking for three things when you're looking at data protection vendors. And, I think you should hold Carbonite up against anyone else that you're looking at. A single solution across all systems. You have endpoints. You have a few servers. Some are virtual. Some are physical. Some are critical. Some are not so critical. Some are here. Some are in the cloud. How many different data protection vendors would you like to work with? Typically, the answer is closer to 1 than 14. And that's because, obviously, there's certain economies of scale in negotiating prices, and we all know that. But it's also because it's easier to work with one vendor. It's easier to have a single throat to choke, and ours is delightfully chokeable. There's just a lot of streamlined advantages to not breaking these pieces up, particularly as IT systems are more and more interrelated. You're also looking for straightforward deployment and administration. Again, most IT people in organizations smaller than a bajillion people are not so hyper-focused that this is their only job, managing the data protection of the systems. Usually they've got plenty of other things to do over the course of the day. They need to be able to pop in and out of the data protection environment as needed and be able to easily pick up where they left off, make changes as they need to make them, deploy it to new servers, and move on with their life and not come back for a little while, and not have a steep learning curve associated with it. And then finally, exceptional support. I always say that support is really the piece that's absolutely most critical in a pinch, right? It's all well and good if your support team is meh, during normal operations, right? But when things go wrong, you want somebody on the other end who's emotionally invested in getting you back up and running as quickly as possible. You're going to want to look for an organization with an exceptional support team. And in fact, I would argue that if you do go through any kind of trial or initial period with any of the technologies that you're looking at, call support. See how they act, see how they're doing. I can tell you from my own experience that our support team is a delight. They answer a lot of my questions, and I assure you I ask far too many. So when we're looking at our approach to data protection, we look at it as an entire data protection platform. As I pointed out on the prior slide, we look at it as a single thing. The single thing is that your business is resting on an IT infrastructure that is comprised of servers and endpoints, of clouds and physical systems, of virtual systems, of all sorts of things. And you, as an IT leader in that organization, basically need to be able to keep that entire system up and running, keep all of that data safe and secure, ensure that you're able to recover quickly, to migrate systems rapidly, and to get everyone's data as rapidly as you can in order to keep the organization operational. The other thing that we very much value is the ability to pick and choose where you deploy your resources in data protection. So that doesn't mean that all systems are created equal. Some need to come up faster than others. Some candidly are worth more than others. And that means that those systems might have different recovery plans than others that can sit idle and not be up and running for a week. And we believe that a single vendor and a single data protection platform should afford you that flexibility as an IT leader to make those choices with your business and optimize both your time and your financial resources against the systems that need it most. And finally, of course, without exceptional security, without amazing customer service, without broad platform support, none of this vision actually comes together for you or for us. So we hang our hat on a great deal of that. Now, if you're not familiar with Carbonite and what we bring to this market, we have thousands of customers worldwide, 26,000 customers worldwide even. And that represents over 160 petabytes of data, which is far more data than you can shake a buffalo at. We have thousands of partners worldwide as well, and a tremendous customer satisfaction rating. This is basically what we do. We protect the data of businesses around the world of all sizes and have been doing it for over 20 years. And we've done it through a set of acquisitions. We've done it through a set of incredible homegrown technologies. And we continue to evolve with the market with a purpose-built focus on what this part of the market needs. Not what's bleeding edge, not what's super hot and cool techie magazines, but what you need in order to keep your business up and running, your data protected, your systems secure. That's what we do. So, back to you then. I think we have some questions, and I welcome any more.
Yep, we'll be happy to. I'll be happy to answer a couple of these. We'll read these out. Maybe we can go through these together. Lemore is asking, have either of you ever dealt with buildings? Think about IoT, building apps, that kind of thing, resiliency with specific with buildings. I haven't, although I do know at the basis of it, you still have applications that need to be backed up and so on. The question really in my mind is about the IoT sensor networks and whether those need to be backed up and recovered and that kind of thing. But do you have any experience in that at all?
Not in specific with the applications that she's mentioning, which is, I will say this though, we take a fairly application and vertical agnostic perspective at Carbonite. What we're finding is that, typically we support anything from x86 physical servers, Windows, Linux, the stuff that we consider standard to stuff that we consider sort of, let's call it exotic now, iSeries, AIX. You might call it legacy. You might call it exotic. We have cloud-based systems as well. And typically, if you support the underlying platform layer, the applications don't always need additional capabilities. It does depend, and I don't have an intimate familiarity with these ones in particular. But we have certain applications where we have instrumented the ability to recover, for example, specific mailboxes in Outlook or whatever. These aren't in specific one of them, but I think for the vast majority of things that we run into, support for the database and OS level is sufficient to getting most of the way there.
All right, so there's another question came in that's a little incomplete, but I'm assuming it's about Carbonite solutions. It says, any costs associated with failback after failover?
Yes. I'm so sorry, I didn't see that one. Not additional costs associated with failback after failover, no. We just coordinate the time with you that you'd like to do that, and we push the button at our leisure with a latte.
With a latte, I mean,
you provide the
like
latte.
That. Yeah, exactly. Latte not included. This is
latte
sort of
another
question. Yes, exactly. Another question that's sort of related, I think, but just to kind of ask, how many times can they test failover and failback before incurring extra costs? You already said there's no cost, but does it matter? Can they test as many times as they let? You mentioned, testing monthly, quarterly, annually, and the one guy was doing it weekly. How does that play into this in terms of how many times they can test it?
Yeah, sure. So when you're failing over into our cloud, you incur and I'm going to call them extremely modest cloud usage costs for the CPU and memory that you're using. It's like sort of dollars per gig per day type numbers. Latte money. Let's call it latte money. And so if you were, for example, wanting to run that test for a week on 100 systems, like that sort of starts adding up to lattes for the office money. But that's the only cost that you're incurring, the cost of running in our environment.
I'm starting to see a connection between lattes and Buffalo. So maybe if they have maybe the lattes are getting the Buffalo, attracting them, and I don't know.
We'll workshop that. Yeah, that's good.
A question here: how often should we be testing recovery of our critical systems? We talked about failover and failback and testing DR in general, but anything about specific systems, maybe?
I think for the critical systems, the best practice that any of the analysts would tell you would be quarterly would be great. Some more compliance-oriented organizations would want monthly. The weekly was aggressive, to be honest. I was surprised. The only caveat I'd put to something like a number like that is that when something interesting changes, whether that's interesting on the systems configuration or on the network configuration, which is often the sticky wicket in the game, you want to test after a change like that occurs, just to make sure that everything is still great. But I think, honestly, for most of the world, and every time I've ever polled the audience on this, people have sort of tentatively said they test maybe once or twice a year. I think if we all got to a place where we were testing quarterly, we would all feel a lot better.
Yeah, I would agree. And just to add to if anything changes, probably as you guys in the audience are defining, what is a critical application. I'm assuming you're doing this, but I'm just going to say it in case somebody's not. Always be thinking about dependencies, and that could be where one of the changes is made. And that may impact the ability to recover. So it may not be something where you think it directly, like, let's say someone puts the application on a different VLAN. Okay, that's something you can definitely tell affected your application or may have an impact on your application. But it could be a dependency, like let's say your directory service or something like that, and maybe that's changed and you weren't thinking necessarily. So just be considerate of your dependencies as well. Another question came in. Ricardo's asking, does Carbonite have agents to back up and restore databases like SQL and Oracle?
The short answer is yes. How's that?
That's enough. Short and sweet, baby. And then last question here I have, and if you have any more questions, you guys in the audience, stick them in here because we still have a couple minutes left. If not, we'll let you out of class early. Last question I have on here is, what do we do if we don't have a secondary location to fail over to?
Oh, what a beautiful question to end on. I love that one. So I think that's the whole point. I love it. The whole point is, please use ours. Most folks don't have a secondary data center to fail over to, and that's why a disaster recovery as a service type offering or a cloud backup service with a recovery option is so amazing, because you can leverage a cloud-based provider, a secure environment like the Carbonite environment, and we will be your secondary site. You won't have to purchase the hardware. You don't have to pay for the raised floor. You don't have to hire a person to plug stuff in. What you get is just the availability of our secondary data centers, which are located across the country and are manned 24/7 and up and running and ready to support you in the event of a disaster. It's really the most cost-effective way to go about this. When you're thinking through the hardware, the space, the human cost, the software cost, and all of that, really for most organizations, the right thing to do is to leverage the cloud on the back end.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think the concept of secondary location in some ways is sort of almost pre-cloud, if you will, where the thinking was you had to have your own secondary location. We used to have the hot and cold sites, and this infrastructure as a service has just made that go completely away. And earlier you had talked about the idea of someone was saying once you've recovered here, keep it here. For some of you, I'm going to just say that that's not a bad idea. I'm actually a proponent in certain circumstances. It might make financial sense for the organization to just keep it there. The challenge is, of course, you just went through a recovery scenario, which cost you time, money, energy, and so on and so forth, and you already have hardware and whatnot on premises that you're already spending money on. Maybe it's CapEx that you bought or whatever the case is. And you might go, well, we're not ready to take that on just yet. So it may not be convenient, but it might still be cost-effective and worth considering anyway. So it looks like we don't have any more questions. So Lilac, hey, thanks for a great conversation today. I think this was really educational. I think we got a lot of information out there.
It was a delight. Let's do it again sometime.
I think we shall. And so you guys, we're going to end up letting you guys out of class early, like I said. And so I'll hand things back to Ashley to close us out.
All right. Thank you, Nick. And thank you again to both of you, Nick and Lilac, for your presentations. And thank you to Carbonite for sponsoring today's webinar. For more information on today's topic, please go to carbonite.com. Just a reminder that this web seminar will be available on demand starting tomorrow, so feel free to come back and review. Thank you for attending and have a wonderful day.